If you search for groundnut, you'll find peanuts. That's the problem. For centuries across Europe, North America, and parts of Asia, the term groundnut referred to something entirely different: small, nutrient-dense tubers pulled from beneath the soil, consumed by indigenous peoples, medieval foragers, and frontier settlers alike. These weren't legumes, they were underground storage organs from plants most modern populations have never heard of. This is the story of earth chestnuts, tuberous plants like Apios americana in North America and Conopodium majus in Europe, once relied upon for survival, now nearly erased from agricultural memory. The question isn't whether they were valuable. Historical records and modern analyses prove they were. The question is how something so widely consumed became so thoroughly forgotten. The confusion starts with terminology. The English word groundnut has been applied to at least a dozen different species across different continents, most of which have nothing to do with peanuts, Ericus hypogea. The plants we're discussing produce underground tubers or corms, not seed pods. In North America, groundnut refers primarily to Apios americana, a perennial vine in the legume family. It climbs through vegetation using twining stems that reach 3 to 6 meters in length. The plant produces strings of tubers along underground rhizomes. Each tuber typically measures 2 to 8 centimeters in diameter. A mature plant develops 5 to 15 tubers connected by thin rhizome tissue. In Britain and parts of Europe, earth chestnut historically referred to Conopodium majus, a member of the carrot family. This plant grows as a solitary herbaceous perennial, producing a single rounded tuber approximately 2 to 4 centimeters in diameter. The tuber sits 10 to 20 centimeters below the soil surface, connected to an erect stem that reaches 30 to 50 centimeters above ground. Additional species carried similar names in their respective regions: Bunium bulbocastanum in Mediterranean Europe, certain Lathyrus species across Asia. The unifying characteristic: edible underground storage organs harvested from wild or semi-cultivated plants, consumed long before modern agriculture established potato and cassava as dominant tubers. The botanical diversity matters because nutritional composition, growing requirements, and historical use patterns vary significantly between species. What follows will focus primarily on Apios americana and Conopodium majus, the two most documented in ethnobotanical and agricultural research. Archaeological evidence places Apios americana in indigenous North American diets for at least 7,000 years. Tuber remains have been recovered from sites across the eastern woodlands, from Quebec to Florida. Early colonial accounts provide detailed descriptions. Samuel de Champlain documented indigenous peoples harvesting what he called rosary roots in 1605. Captain John Smith wrote in 1612 that groundnuts were as good as potatoes and a dietary staple among coastal tribes. The preparation methods were specific. Fresh tubers were boiled, roasted in coals, or dried for winter storage. Dried tubers could be ground into flour and mixed with cornmeal. The texture after cooking was described consistently across sources: mealy, similar to chestnuts or sweet potatoes, with a flavor noted as mildly sweet and nutty. European settlers adopted groundnut consumption, particularly during periods of crop failure. Historical records from the Plymouth colony indicate groundnuts sustained colonists through the winter of 1621-1622, when grain supplies failed. The practice continued through the 18th century in frontier regions where European crops hadn't fully established. Conopodium majus occupied a parallel role in European food systems. Medieval herbals describe earth nuts as foraged food gathered from woodlands and hedgerows. The tubers were eaten raw or roasted. References appear in Anglo-Saxon agricultural texts and persist through the 17th century. The plant held particular importance in Scotland and Ireland, where Gaelic names, Crim, Coramail, indicate cultural significance beyond casual foraging. The consumption pattern was seasonal. Tubers were harvested in late summer and autumn after the above-ground plant had stored maximum carbohydrates. This positioned earth chestnuts as a bridge food between the summer harvest and winter grain stores. Modern chemical analysis reveals why these tubers sustained populations effectively. Apios americana tubers contain approximately 16 to 20% protein by dry weight, 3 times the protein content of potatoes, which average 5 to 6%. The protein quality is notable. Essential amino acid profiling shows lysine content of 5 to 6 grams per 100 grams of protein, comparable to legume seeds. The carbohydrate fraction consists primarily of starch, 50 50 to 60% by dry weight, with significantly higher fiber content than cultivated tubers. Mineral analysis shows iron concentrations of 3 to 5 milligrams per 100 grams fresh weight, calcium at 40 to 80 milligrams, and potassium at 400 to 600 milligrams. Conopodium majus presents a different nutritional profile. The tubers contain lower protein, approximately 4 to 6% by dry weight, but higher concentrations of certain minerals. Historical accounts emphasize the sweet flavor, suggesting higher simple sugar content relative to starch compared to Apios. The caloric density of both species ranges from 70 to 100 calories per 100 grams of fresh tuber, comparable to potatoes at 77 calories per 100 grams. However, the protein content creates a significant nutritional distinction. A diet based partially on Apios tubers provides substantially more protein than one based on potatoes, reducing dependence on animal products or cultivated legumes. Research from Louisiana State University analyzed multiple Apios genotypes and found vitamin C content ranging from 8 to 15 milligrams per 100 grams fresh weight, lower than potatoes, but sufficient to prevent scurvy in populations consuming them regularly. The nutritional advantage becomes clear in subsistence contexts. Indigenous populations and early settlers relying on groundnuts obtained both caloric energy and protein from a single foraged source, reducing the agricultural effort required for nutritional adequacy. Apios americana grows across a broad ecological range, from USDA hardiness zones 3 through 9. The plant tolerates diverse soil conditions, but shows preference for moist, slightly acidic soils near waterways. It's commonly found along stream banks, wetland edges, and bottomland forests, habitats with consistent soil moisture. As a legume, Apios forms nitrogen-fixing nodules on its roots, improving soil fertility while growing. Field measurements indicate nitrogen fixation rates of 40 to 80 kilograms per hectare annually, comparable to cultivated soybeans. This characteristic allows Apios to thrive in nitrogen-poor soils where other crops struggle. Yield data comes primarily from experimental plots rather than commercial cultivation. Research trials at Louisiana State University documented fresh tuber yields of 4 to 9 metric tons per hectare under managed conditions. That's 20 to 40% of typical potato yields, which range from 20 to 40 metric tons per hectare in commercial production. The tuber development timeline creates a challenge for domestication. Apios requires 2 to 3 growing seasons to produce tubers of harvestable size from seed. Vegetative propagation from tuber fragments accelerates this, but still requires 18 to 24 months for substantial yields. Potatoes produce harvestable crops 90 to 120 days after planting. Conopodium majus presents different agricultural characteristics. The plant prefers well-drained soils and partial shade, woodland edges and hedgerows rather than open fields. Tuber size remains small regardless of cultivation efforts, typically maxing out at 4 centimeters diameter. Historical foraging yields rather than agricultural yields define realistic expectations. Storage behavior limits both species. Apios tubers maintain quality for 3 to 6 months under cool, humid conditions. Beyond this period, desiccation or sprouting reduces edibility. Potatoes, by contrast, store reliably for 8 to 12 months under proper conditions. Systematic agricultural research on Apios americana began in the 1980s, primarily at Louisiana State University and the University of Minnesota. The goal was evaluating domestication potential for marginal agricultural lands. Breeding programs selected for larger tuber size, shorter maturation time, and reduced vine growth. Results established biological limits. After 15 years of selection, average tuber size increased from 30 grams to approximately 70 grams, still substantially smaller than cultivated potatoes at 100 to 300 grams. The maturation time decreased from 36 months to 24 months, but remained incompatible with annual cropping systems. Ethnobotanical documentation provides the bulk of historical evidence. Anthropological field studies with Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and other tribes documented traditional ecological knowledge regarding harvest timing, preparation methods, and storage techniques. These records confirm widespread historical consumption, but also reveal that groundnuts were supplementary foods rather than primary staples, consumed alongside wild rice, corn, and game. Research on Conopodium majus remains limited to botanical surveys and chemical analysis. No domestication programs exist. The primary scientific interest focuses on conservation of wild populations, which have declined across much of Western Europe due to habitat loss. The research base establishes a clear conclusion. These plants were valuable wild and semi-managed food sources, but lack the characteristics that would make them competitive with modern cultivated crops under current agricultural systems. The disappearance wasn't sudden. It was incremental displacement over several centuries. Multiple factors converged. Labor intensity tops the list. Harvesting Apios requires locating underground rhizome chains by tracing vines, then carefully excavating tubers without damaging the connecting tissue needed for next year's growth. In indigenous management systems, this knowledge was passed intergenerationally. In European agricultural systems adapted for annual grain crops, the skill base didn't transfer. Potatoes arrived in Europe in the late 16th century and in North America via European reintroduction. Potatoes offered compelling advantages: larger tubers, annual harvest cycles, and compatibility with plow-based agriculture. By the 18th century, potato cultivation had spread across Europe. By the 19th century, it dominated temperate agriculture globally. The mechanization of agriculture sealed groundnut's fate. Potatoes could be planted and harvested with machinery. Groundnuts required hand harvesting. As agricultural labor shifted from subsistence farming to wage labor and mechanized commodity production, crops incompatible with machines became economically unviable. The naming confusion played a subtle but significant role. When peanuts, Ericus hypogea, entered global trade in the 18th and 19th centuries, they inherited the name groundnut in English-speaking markets. The original groundnuts lacked commercial presence, botanical standardization, or advocacy groups to preserve distinct nomenclature. The name transferred to the more economically important crop, and the original plants faded from public consciousness. Cultural factors compounded the trend. As wild foraging declined and industrialized food systems expanded, knowledge of wild tubers became confined to rural communities, then to elderly community members, then disappeared entirely in most regions. The plants themselves didn't vanish. Apios americana still grows abundantly across its native range, but the knowledge of edibility did. Interest in groundnuts has resurged over the past 3 decades, driven by several movements. Indigenous food sovereignty initiatives have reclaimed traditional foods, including Apios americana, as part of cultural preservation and health improvement efforts. Organizations like the Native American Food Sovereignty Alliance document traditional ecological knowledge and promote cultivation. Permaculture and forest gardening movements have embraced Apios as a perennial nitrogen-fixing crop, suitable for polyculture systems. Small-scale growers in North America cultivate it in home gardens and community plots, valuing its ability to produce food in marginal spaces, fence lines, stream banks, woodland edges, unsuitable for annual crops. Heritage crop preservation programs have initiated collection and evaluation of Apios genetic diversity. Seed Savers Exchange and similar organizations maintain collections of different regional varieties. These efforts focus on preservation rather than commercialization. Conopodium majus has seen renewed interest from foraging communities in the UK and Ireland. Field guides and foraging workshops teach identification and harvest techniques. The plant remains protected in some jurisdictions due to population declines, limiting harvest to personal consumption rather than commercial collection. Several small businesses have emerged selling Apios tubers as planting stock, targeting home gardeners and permaculture practitioners. Pricing reflects the niche market status. Individual tubers sell for $3 to $5 each, compared to pennies per pound for seed potatoes. Commercial food production remains absent. No industrial-scale cultivation exists. No processed products appear in grocery stores. The Rediscovery exists entirely at the scale of individual enthusiasts, indigenous communities, and research institutions. The case for groundnut relevance rests on specific niches rather than universal application. In regions with suitable climate and ecology, Apios offers a perennial protein-producing crop requiring minimal inputs. For small-scale growers seeking food security from marginal land, it provides functional value that annual crops cannot. The nitrogen fixing capacity creates potential for agroforestry and permaculture systems, where soil improvement and food production occurs simultaneously. This addresses legitimate agricultural challenges in degraded soils and low input systems. The nutritional profile, particularly the protein content, fills a gap in temperate perennial crop options. Most perennial food crops produce primarily carbohydrates or fats. Apios produces protein at levels approaching annual legumes while functioning as a perennial tuber. These advantages exist within clear limitations. The yield per hectare remains too low for commodity agriculture. The harvest labor remains too high for commercial viability at current wage rates. The storage limitations prevent long-distance shipping and extended marketing windows. The plants are not solutions to global food security. They're regional foods suited to specific ecological and economic contexts. Their value lies in increasing diversity within local food systems rather than replacing established staples. The historical record is unambiguous. Groundnuts, Apios americana, Conopodium majus, and related species sustained human populations across multiple continents for thousands of years. Modern analysis confirms their nutritional value. Agricultural trials establish their cultivation requirements and yield potential. What the evidence also confirms is why they were replaced. Potatoes and other cultivated tubers offer superior yields, easier harvest, longer storage, and compatibility with mechanized agriculture. The displacement wasn't conspiracy, it was competition, and groundnuts lost on practical metrics that mattered to expanding agricultural societies. The naming confusion erased them from collective memory more thoroughly than agricultural displacement alone could have achieved. When groundnut meant peanuts, the original plants lost their linguistic anchor, becoming nameless to populations that had forgotten what they once consumed. They're not lost, the plants still exist and the knowledge of their use is being documented and revived, but their future role will be specialized, not universal. They represent what we chose not to domesticate and what we may choose to remember.